assessments that subcultures are bound to fail politically because they cannot totally fuck the system, sets up the ideal of true politics as a fucking up of the totalizing view of a system, right? It sets up a totalizing view of the system on the one hand, and an equally totalizing view of the revolution through politics on the other hand, right? As a total negation of the system. So the question is, why assume the system is so totalizing and that its negation must similarly be totalizing, right? Rather than aiming to totally fuck the system, as in the traditional vision of the communist revolution, Shane Green argues that subcultures underfuck the system. It disrupts the system from beneath, as it were. But what is this underfucking? So Green's article is short and it doesn't provide really what that underfucking would be. But the point of my presentation today is to try to elaborate this modes of practice, subcultural practice, as ways of underfucking the system. It's not a total revolution. It's not a total negation of the system with a capital S, but it's a continual disruption of the system to prevent the system from becoming a totality, in fact. So that's what we will try to do. So we will try to look at Fred Moulton's notion of fugitivity, look at a bit of a notion of fidelity that appears in Badiou's work, read through Colin Wright's book on Jamaica. And then we will turn to Oliver Marhart's work briefly. So that's the plan. So fugitivity, the first one, from Moulton. The first strategy or mode of subcultural practice that I want to discuss is fugitivity, something, and we can say that it's a bit like vanishing from view or hiding from the detection systems, surveillance systems of the state and capital, right? So in Black radical thought, the term fugitivity evokes the legacy of slaves who escape and maroon communities. That's to say, the legacy of those who escape formal systems of power to create clandestine and self-determined spaces, right? So that's why Moulton brings the term fugitivity into his theory. It connects to the Black experience. And one of the most important thinkers in contemporary Black studies, Fred Moulton, and his collaborator, Stefano Harney, has extended this notion of fugitivity to extended this idea to modern undercommons, which are subversive collectives forming in the interstices of the state. Interstices of the state and institutions like universities, and united by the refusal to be governed by the norms of the dominant system. So as Jack Halberstam explains in his introduction to Moulton and Hartwig's book on the undercommons, those of the undercommons cannot be, quote from Halberstam, satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part, end of quote. So the undercommons, the fugitive collective, thus refuses to ask for recognition, and instead, the fugitive we wants to take apart, dismantle, tear down the structure that right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know lie outside its walls. So that's also from Halberstam. So while it is not possible to say what new structures will replace the old, the ones we live with right now, Halberstam says that tearing the shit down, by tearing the shit down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. So, but fugitivity is not just about hiding and evading capture, right? So it is about evading the view of the view and surveillance of the dominant hegemony, but it's not just about hiding, right? For Bolton and Harney, fugitivity is also about planning and study, by which they mean, quote from them, reaching out to find connection, making common causes with the brokenness of being, end of quote. In other words, actualizing social relations and forms of life the existing dominant social order cannot countenance without need or expectation of recognition from the dominant order. That this strategy of fugitivity resonates strongly with underground music and art scenes needs no reminding, I think. I think it's pretty clear. We can think of the DIY, do-it-yourself culture, characteristic of punk, as something that chimes with, resonates with fugitivity. An assemblage of self-recorded albums, zines, illegal venues for gathering and concerts sustain a community outside the official channel. And subcultures of this sort make a virtue of operating in obscurity, forging solidarity away from, and often in spite of institutional recognition. Oh, sorry, I missed the slide. So that was the slide that I was talking about. So while we cannot deny the persistence and importance of identity and identity politics within subcultural communities, fugitivity is not just about identity politics. In the sense it is not aimed at receiving recognition from some higher authority. So Moten says that fugitivity is practiced, quote, practiced on and over the edge of politics, beneath its ground, end of quote. It doesn't operate at the level of what usually counts as politics. Moten's formulation of subcultural studies, Moten's formulation of beneath the ground of usual politics lends the notion of fugitivity nicely to subcultural studies. Seen through the lens of fugitivity, underground is a space for gathering, relations, and affective communities, through which we learn to occupy the world differently. Hence, Moten is able to call it a kind of study, fugitive study. So while Moten's own notion of fugitivity was articulated, as I said earlier, in relation to the Atlantic slave trade and slavery in North America, it is very much worth noting that Southeast Asia historically was one of the great spaces of fugitivity. This was documented in the provocative book by James C. Scott, titled "The Art of Not Being Governed, Not Belonging." Sorry. Where the art of not being governed, I mean, where the anarchist historian James C. Scott told stories of indigenous people of the continental Southeast Asia who deliberately chose the path of what their colonial opponents deemed barbarism. So people who avoided kingdoms, both European and Buddhist, to seek refuge in the highlands and forests of continental Southeast Asia, area that we now call Somia. It was a term coined by an anthropologist whose name I cannot recall right now. Like the fugitive world of Somia in the 19th and early 20th century, contemporary fugitive practices will often be dismissed as barbaric, ungovernable, corruptive, deviant. But such are assessments issued from above, from the positions of dominant hegemony. Right? So let's draw some conclusion about this fugitivity, this notion of fugitivity. We can take fugitivity as naming. What it does is to name subculture as a lived practice, a continual experiment in life outside the state's terms or the terms of the dominant hegemony. And it reminds us that going underground is not simply or not even mainly a retreat, but a proactive mode of what Moten would call fugitive planning, That is to say, a practice of prefiguring new ways of being by withdrawing consent from the existing system and creating informal counterstructures in its shadow, employing frequently strategies of decentralization and anonymity to elude capture. So always moving, regrouping, and refusing to be caught in the fixes of the representation of rule. Fugitivity is a mode of subcultural practice that keeps radical ideas and identities alive in conditions that are inhospitable to them. So next we will move to fidelity, a notion central to the French philosopher Alain Badiou. While Badiou is without question one of the most significant French philosophers of the past century, he is a troubling figure for cultural studies. Because in his view, there is no such thing as cultural politics. Politics, he says, is acultural. This signals his decisive break with Gramscian thinking that has heavily influenced cultural studies from the early days. The theorists influenced by Gramsci, such as Stuart Hall, emphasize how culture and the domain of existence that culture underpins, namely society and its regimes of representation. He emphasizes those as a prime site of hegemonic struggle, and therefore as inherently political. Badiou rejects this picture by insisting that authentic politics, what he might call politics of truth, breaks from tradition, identity, breaks from tradition and identity and even history in favor of radical novelty and radical transformation. So in this view, any identitarian category articulated around terms such as race, class, gender, sexuality, nationality, religion, that is part of the mechanism of the status quo. And the point of politics in one of its dimensions, according to Badiou, is to be a process that evades any such identitarian capture. And by doing so, politics touches what Badiou calls the generic being of humanity, pure and simple. So politics, therefore, is subtractive in Badiou's terminology. It is not about articulating identities. It's not about generating new identities even. Rather, politics is about creating a genericity that evades any particularistic identification. Indeed, this is one of the essential dimensions of what Badiou provocatively calls a truth. Politics of truth can only happen, therefore, at a distance from any regime of representation, which Badiou basically identifies with the state. And we might also associate representation with the mainstream or dominant culture. Badiouian politics is, by its nature, underground. What is important to note is that for Badiou, every politics, or more precisely, every true politics, begins with what he calls an event, a moment of rupture in the ordinary workings of things. And this moment is a moment of inspiration for those who recognize it. And politics begins when a collective that recognizes the event attempts to verify or test the universal egalitarian truth in their given situation. Thus, while Badiou allows there may be simulacra or inauthentic events, the implication of authentic, true events are always egalitarian and universal, or in Badiou's terminology, absolutely generic. Absolutely generic, right? That's his term for sort of a universal equality. Despite the difficulty of Badiou's theoretical elaboration of truth genericity, which relies on set theory, post-contemporary set theory, we can note that Badiou's rethinking of truth is we can try to see what Badiou's rethinking of truth is trying to capture in a more intuitive way. So in principle, what Badiou theorizes as an event implies the birth of a universal truth that can be taken up by anyone at all in any number of particular contexts or situations. So let's take an example. In the French Revolution, so the French Revolution counts as Badiou's event, one of the true events for Badiou. The egalitarian and universal principle, what Badiou calls prescription sometimes, that erupted into the French situation by the event of the French Revolution was that everyone is created equal. Now, this principle could be taken up by those who were, at least at the beginning of the French Revolution, the historical event, was not its direct addressee. For example, early French feminists already asked whether liberté, égalité, et fraternité, the liberty, equality, and fraternity, the slogan of the revolution, applies to women. That is to say, they try to test and verify the truth of the principle in the situation of French society. Moreover, the universality of the truth does not limit itself to the geographical Europe. Hence, in the revolution of Haiti against France, so anti-colonial revolt, the Black Spartacus of San Domingo, Toussaint Louverture, could direct the principle of equality and liberty of the French Revolution against the French colonizers. So Badiou's conviction is that by exploring and verifying the consequences of one event in an infinite plurality of situations, humanity is capable of producing something radically new in their given situation, something that can induce a radical transformation of the situation, radical transformation of the social situation. But he also cautions that the moment that the results of these explorations are fully represented and inscribed in our system of accepted knowledge, a term that for Badiou is conceptually analogous to the state, analogous to status capture, the process of truth initiated by the event is put on hiatus. So truth, whose being Badiou argues is a novelty heterogeneous to a situation, is for that reason totally other than knowledge. Since Badiou equates cultures with ordinariness or the everyday and the realm of representation, it is to be expected that his politics of truth would be acultural, given his architecture, given his theoretical architecture. So, so I find what Badiou calls fidelity to be an essential part of politics, because politics cannot be just about pursuing any interesting possibility that opens up, but only those that we can connect to the event, the moment of inspiration whose consequences a given political practice or sequence is committed to unfolding. So there is a sense of commitment to a moment of shared inspiration in politics as well, I think, in subcultural practice, and perhaps a too one-sided celebration of spontaneity, regiometric connections, and flow of affects might need to be balanced by a sense of discipline that fidelity implies. So this is a point that's made by Colin Wright, a scholar of Jamaican origin, who argues that the Jamaican Rastafari movement, a crucial part of reggae, could be read in terms of his fidelity to the event of Morant Bay Rebellion of 1865, when protests led by formerly enslaved Jamaicans for justice and fair treatment were brutally suppressed by the British. If the appending of the colonial logic is the significance of the event of Morant Bay in 1865, then the Jamaican subcultural practice is the unfolding of the consequences of this event. So there is fidelity to an event in the culture, in the Jamaican music culture. Yet if fidelity is discernible in cultural and subcultural practices, as Wright shows, then we need to revise Badiou's view that culture is incompatible with true politics, and that cultural politics is an oxymoron. We need to revise that. So Colin Wright proposes that every fidelity, he does the revision by suggesting that every fidelity is sustained by an evental culture, which you might understand here as the collective knowledge, strategies, clandestine networks, and relations that supports the subcultural subject to go on against the odds. This culture is not some static, ordinary culture that Badiou doesn't like, but it is the culture, a shared ethos that allows the effective practice of the ethical maxim that Badiou assigns to the faithful subject, the subject of fidelity. A quote from Beckett. So that's his maxim, right? Try again, fail better. As Badiou often suggests, what we must learn is to continue in the face of disappointment and failures. And if subculture is evental, if is capable of supporting true politics, we will find in subculture an eventual culture where individuals and collectives learn how to go on, learn how to continue to continue. So that is the notion of fidelity. That is one thing, the second dimension of subcultural practice that we can identify. So we move on to the third mode of subcultural practice, becoming major. So the third and last strategy of resistance or subcultural practice is becoming major. As already is clear, it's a term that deliberately overturns an idea from Deleuze and Guattari, becoming minor. So fugitive planning, which we discussed earlier, certainly can be understood as a matter of becoming minor, right? It's a work of evading capture by the dominant power. Now, however, I want to suggest following post-Marxists, Gramscians, in arguing that at some point, politics must involve a process of making one's resistance count on a larger scale, and to have an effect on contexts and situations other than the underground in which it normally operates. And subculture, if it is to be political, cannot shun that process, shun that moment of becoming major. At this point, you might ask, is there an essential incompatibility between subcultural practice and hegemony as a politics of becoming major? Is becoming major incompatible with subcultural practice or underground? Is becoming major selling out, becoming normie? Probably not quite, I think. We can regard becoming major as the process by which underground is propelled upward into the arena of political contestation, contestation with enemies, adversaries. To put it differently, becoming major designates the process whereby the underground becomes a counterpublic. So one could argue, what is an example of becoming major? Protests, mass demonstrations, mass mobilizations are paradigmatic, visible forms of becoming major. But becoming major can take other forms. So one might argue, I think, I'm not going to commit to this argument, that K-pop, which is a relatively recent subculture, I guess, in the West, in the Western context at least, evinces aspects of becoming major. While one might criticize many aspects of its commercialism and fandom culture, it seems unfair to dismiss at the outset the profound consequences it has had for Korean and Asian representation in Europe and the US, for instance, or how the K-pop fandom in the US, for example, emerged as an impactful progressive voice against racism and chauvinism, both online and offline. But whether in the form of directly political action or more subtle cultural shifts, becoming major always implies a clash or conflict with an external other or enemy. As Oliver Mahart explains, antagonism is necessary for politicization, and he argues that politicization occurs at the point of external contact. That is to say, subculture must clash with something that it is not, some opposing force for it to be politicized. Making a point close to that made by the Gramscians of British cultural studies, Oliver Mahart asserts that without antagonism, subcultural resistance risks aestheticization. It becomes mere aesthetics, just as Heptich had criticized. So what happens? What happens with becoming major? Using the terminology of Marhart's mentor, the Argentinian political theorist Ernesto Laclau, we can say the following. Becoming major involves constructing chains of equivalence that link diverse, smaller local struggles. What individuals learn from subcultural existence, which are the fruits of fugitive planning and study, allows subculture to become one of the key elements that makes this linkage, this chain of equivalence of diverse elements possible. So the previously invisible undergrounds in the plural become important nodal points, connecting points in a counter public that mobilizes to contest dominant hegemony. The anti-globalization movements of the 90s and early 2000s, which Marhart has analyzed at length, exemplifies what is meant by the creation of a counter-public. In such protests, heterogeneous identities or social actors from environmentalists, indigenous activists, and anarchists to unionists link through equivalential chains into what Marhart calls the movement of movements, a movement of movements. The cultural and political consequences of a movement of this kind is profound because they do not end with just one protest or one mobilization or one or achievement of a set of a finite objectives. Rather, such a movement is able to define the political imaginary of a generation. The anti-globalization movement is not fixed to the particular protest in Seattle in 1999, nor to the international collective of activists that meet in Porto Alegre. We know also that Occupy Wall Street, for example, another example of becoming major, I think, did not start and end in New York City. Rather, a particular protest or gathering may inspire when it becomes major. It may inspire a plurality of other movements, possibly opening up a new horizon of political possibility. So it should be noted that becoming major is not just about building unity, on the other hand. The counterpublic it creates retains an internally agonistic dimension among the heterogeneous identities in its chain of equivalence. Why? Because according to the radical democratic theory that underpins this thinking, a public that is homogeneous is not really public at all. For the same reason, we can't call a public space a space that cannot be that can be occupied by only those who are in all agreement about everything, right? That's not a public space if everyone is just in consensual. Real plurality implies difference, and difference implies some form of conflict, which needs to be continually negotiated. So even in the counter-public that I'm talking about with becoming major, that dimension, that dimension of difference and conflict is not erased internally. But despite the internal difference, there is a kind of solidarity to the counterpublic, a kind of unity that is staged through the naming of a common enemy, be it a corrupt power, racism, and sexism, or financial capital, or so on and so forth. So I mean, let's try to do a concluding remark. So I've discussed the three modes of practice, right? Fugitivity, fidelity, and becoming major. So how do we bring them into a close, and how do I connect it to the idea of post-foundationalism? So to bring the discussion to close, so post-foundationalism says, as I noted earlier at the beginning, post-foundationalism says that a harmonious society devoid of conflictuality, antagonism is an impossibility. That is why the social is constantly trembling. It is constantly agitated by antagonism. It is touched by conflict. So antagonism, conflictuality may be dormant. It may be in a sleeping state at some times and eruptive at other times. It has different modalities. And politics always unfolds as the fluctuation of the modalities of this antagonism that grounds the social in a strange, paradoxical way. What then is subculture? What is the underground? What is the underground at least some subcultures occupy? To put it in post-foundationalist terms, subculture is a subterranean force, It is what lurks beneath politics as usual, and what Badiou would see as culture as ordinariness. It is what causes the tremble of the social from below, or from the gaps and cracks that the dominant hegemony has not mastered. By maintaining the inconsistency or incompleteness of the social, subculture is what prevents a society from entering a state of self-satisfactory realization or self-satisfying realization of peace and harmony. In other words, subculture is one of the key ontic embodiments of the ontological tremble that destabilizes the ground of the social. Active in the interstices of the state and dominant hegemonies, and keeping alive the conflictuality that they suppress, subculture underfucks the system constantly. An occasion by surging force from above, in a process we have called becoming major, subculture may be a catalyst for a serious challenge against dominant hegemonies. Okay. So thank you. That was the sort of the talk, end of the talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kim, for the thought-provoking presentations. I think that your reflections on fugitivity, fidelity, and becoming major challenge us to rethink that how subcultural energy moves between the margins and also the mainstream, how the underground remains a living space of invention and not just of resistance. You also invite us to think beyond the old binaries of resistance and cooptation, showing how subcultural practices, whether like in punk, otaku culture, or K-pop, or any digital underground networks, continuously invents new forms of collective life. Now, we will open the floor for question and discussion. We have 10 to 15 minutes for discussions. If you are in the room, please raise your hand and I will invite you to speak. And if you are joining us online, you may type your questions in the chat box. When you ask your questions, please also mention your name and institutions.
While we while we wait for questions, can I ask a question, Arif?
Yeah, sure.
So when I got the invitation for the invitation to deliver the keynote today, I saw in the title power pop, right?
Yes.
So I was wondering, the first idea that came to my mind was, okay, you guys are inviting me to talk about K-pop.
Which you also include in your presentation, actually, right?
Yes, I found it like obligatory to mention because, in a sense, I mean, you know, K-pop, you might look at, K-pop as totally manufactured, inauthentic music and so on and so forth. But there is a sense in which people, especially those outside Korea, there is a sense in which they miss how back in the early days of K-pop, before it was named K-pop, right? It was a kind of a youth culture that was regarded as, deviant in South Korea, right? I remember very well, like when I was a kid, how your parents and your grandfathers who would talk about this fandom, this crazy fans as deviant and well, they should be studying or something like that. They always say that, right? And they look at K-pop music, right? And say, oh, this doesn't reflect anything about traditional Korean music.
Yes.
Why do they use so much, English lyrics? It has no poetic value and so and so forth, right? So in a sense, it was a kind of youth culture that tried to break from the demand to be Korean in a very specific way. And I think that is something that's worth mentioning. And the fact that it is now really, it has always been covered. And K-pop was inspired in the early days by the Motown and things like that. A lot of
Yeah, yeah.
American black culture and so forth
Mhm.
and so on, so on. The creators of the early K-pop music were sort of a serious students of that black culture in some way.
Okay.
So I mean there are rather than dismissing it outright, we can see traces traces that we might characterize as subcultural even
Yeah, yeah, that's
in
true.
K-pop like this.
You
So
know, so in K-pop itself, I think most of the lyrics right now are not in Korean, right?
yeah, a lot of them,
A
yeah, yeah,
lot of
yeah,
them right now are written in English,
yeah, yeah. I
so
mean,
it's
it
not
is to
original
it
anymore.
it is in order to attract international audience to help you sing along, I
Yeah,
guess.
that's true.
I think that's
And
part of the reason. Yeah.
regarding this notion, so how do you see today's youth cultures, subcultures like K-pop, indie music, online fandoms? Do you think that it fits into your idea of fugitivity? Are they still underground, or have they already become the
Hmm.
part of mainstream, so they
Hmm.
cannot
Hmm.
underfox the system from below?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question because they are not really fugitive. If you are able to, if you're able to voice your views and in the open, there is a sense in which it's not entirely fugitive, right?
Mm,
The fugitivity that Moulton and Harney are talking about are radical. So their book is basically about university, like
mm,
institutionalized university,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
becoming highly bureaucratic, and there is a restrictions. Their book was written 10 years ago, but things are more
Mhm.
serious now. Things are worse now because there are
Yeah.
so many more restrictions about what you can teach, especially in
Mhm.
the American context in the Trump
Mhm.
era.
Mhm.
So fugitivity, in that sense, fugitivity is a creation of an undercommons, an underground commons
Mm,
of
okay.
people who study, people who pursue possibilities that are not sanctioned, right?
Okay.
K-pop fans who can write on their Instagram posts political statements, they are not really fugitive in that sense,
Oh,
unless they
okay.
actually risk
Mm,
sanction by
right.
doing it. But my suggestion, my view with the idea of becoming major, which I mentioned
Mhm.
in the end, is that in the end, even fugitive practices must find an opportunity to surge forth, to
Okay.
come into light, and maybe you know maybe you know you might look at, oh, that's becoming mainstream, becoming normie, but everything that we many things that we consider to be normal, many things we accept as ordinary and universal, and in the beginning they were
That's
minor
true.
practices, they
That's
were
true.
something that was particularistic and something that was subversive, right?
That's true.
So the real subcultural strategy is to bring to light what we have learned in the fugitive experience,
Mhm.
the exploration of possibilities that were not sanctioned by the official institutions and mainstream culture. What we discover in that underground has to
Mhm.
be brought into light to bear um, on the field of the social at large. So
Mhm.
that's the connection between fugitivity and becoming major.
Wow. Okay. Wow, it's a wild idea. And since we also include punk in our topic, yeah. So do you think that punk still exists as a subculture today, or has it already become part of pop culture?
So that's the question that I try to prevent in the beginning by saying that I do not know punk very well, right? And the
Yeah.
only Indonesian punk band that I know is Superman instead. But I mean, I don't think it's really fair to say punk as a whole. From the little that I do know about punk, I think it's
Mhm,
unfair
mhm,
to say it's just pop culture or mainstream. I think sure, elements of punk are always recuperated. They always enter uh, the mainstream culture, but that's not the fault of punk. They have always tried to find new ways to underfuck the system. That's the
yeah, yeah.
in the
That's
end.
true.
Insofar as that inventive spirit remains,
That's true.
yes, what used to be punk is now mainstream. Some aesthetic, some style or whatever is now mainstream, sure. But
Yeah,
what's important is the continual commitment to find new ways to underfuck the system, find
that's
new
true.
ways of becoming fugitive, right? Insofar as that remains, punk
Yeah.
still lives, I
Yeah,
would
the
say.
ideology is still there, right? The punk ideology is still there.
Yeah.
And the
So the
movement,
fidelity, what I
the
termed
fidelity,
fidelity,
that's true.
is still there. Yes.
There's a question from the audience, Anastasia Melati. Hi, as someone working with dance and embodied practices, I'm curious how the notion of evental culture as subculture could be understood in relation to performance, where events often oscillate between marginal and institutional spaces. How might bodily practices enact this trembling between subculture and dominant culture?
Yeah.
Sort
Okay. Thank you. Really good question. I actually recognize the Anastasia. Never met in person, but friend of a friend, I think. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a really clear, developed answer, but I do think it's kind of interesting to look at embodied practice. Now, when political theorists that I mentioned, Oliver Marhart and Ernest Laclau, when they talk about protests, when they talk about politics, they're talking about sort of a discursive articulation. Okay, discourse is material practice, but they're not really talking about what embodiment per se. They're not talking about bodies per se. One theorist close to Laclau who tries to talk about embodiment is Judith Butler. So she asks, okay, what actually happens when we go on a protest? What is our bodily condition of embodiment? What does it have to do with being together in the setting, on the streets and so on? And what's the relation of that, this bodily embodiment in a collective space? What's its connection to a politics? What does it imply for political practice and so on? Now, I don't have a really clear answer here, but I think one of the interesting things about subculture and especially punk is that it is a very what's the word that I'm looking for? Visceral experience. It maintains a way of it's an experience of being together. I mean, I haven't gone to many punk concerts, but I've been to many rock concerts. It's you're being pushed against other bodies, right? You're in a packed
That's true.
space, in some dimly lit underground space, usually
That's
full
true.
of smoke and
That's true.
cigarette smell, and you're pushed against and you jump and move together and so on, right? And that kind of experience, I think, is not something it is something that we learn through this underground subcultural practices, right? And they translate into protest spaces. People who have not been exposed, I think, to this idea of being together in a packed space, moving together, chanting together, the way they do politics would be very different from the kind of protest politics that radical Democrats envision. Right? Learning to being with other bodies is something that subculture does teach you in a way that many other practices do not. So I think that's something to consider. Our institution in a capitalist society, our bodies, we are usually atomized. We interact with other people not based on their sort of a physical visceral existence, but on what their qualifications are, how valuable that other person is, and so on and so forth. What their job is, what their role is in relation to our function. That's institutionalization. Subculture, it promotes a kind of being with others that is not reducible to that kind of institutionalization or atomization. So I think that's what's important in subculture and body. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I hope it answers your question, Anastasia. Yeah. Okay. Dr. Kim, it was a very nice discussion, but unfortunately, our schedule is very tight. So thank you for today's discussion, and it always reminded us that subculture is not just matter of style; it's a living politics of imagination, a way of thinking and feeling that keeps the social ground trembling. On behalf of Punk Scholars Network Indonesia, Universitas Sanata Dharma, and Semut Api, I would like to express our deepest appreciation to Dr. Min Kim for sharing his insights and to all of you for being part of this very important present and participation. Have a
Yeah,
great
thank
day,
you for your
everyone.
invitation. Have a wonderful conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pak Kim and Mas Arif for the very great presentation and very insightful. So actually, I have a question, but I don't know how to ask this because I'm still also wondering how to ask this. All right, before Pak Min, don't leave the room because we have to take photos together. So please, everyone, all the people in the Zoom, open the camera on. And as usual, when we have a webinar or conference, Zoom, the end of the session, we're going to take photos together and it will be published on our social media. And don't forget also, please come forward. Ada telepon. Okay, wait. Okay, from the count to three. 1, 2, 3. Again, once again, 1, 2, 3. All right, because the time also is tight. Okay, it's 20 minutes to 2. So we're going to move to another panel online session 1, and it will be moderated by Mbak Ari Kurniawati. Also, Mbak Ari Kurniawati will recall the short bio, and probably read or not, it's up to you. And then we will have the panel online session 1 from 20 minutes to 2 until 15:15. Yep, until 3:15. Mbak Ari, are you there? Mbak Ari udah datang kah?
Ya, aku di sini.
Oke, Mbak Ari. Silakan lanjutkan, Mbak Ari. Terima kasih.
Oh, ini kita langsung aja ya.
Langsung aja, nggak ada break karena
Oke.
waktunya.
Ya, terima kasih Kak Fahran untuk waktu dan kesempatannya. Sekarang kita masuk ke panel setelah tadi kita mendengarkan keynote yang sangat luar biasa dari Pak Min. Panel pertama ini tema besarnya adalah Beyond the Screen, Power Play and Representation. Ada 4 pembicara, ada 4 narasumber. Saya akan menyebutkan satu-satu ya. Jadi yang pertama ada Resti Ayu Febriani, Siska Ayu Dia Sekarini, dan juga Hadijah Albarhanafi. Jadi yang mereka ini akan membawakan paper mereka atau tulisan mereka tentang Class, Gender, and Resistance, Intertextual Feminism in Katniss Everdeen, motif dan pengalaman bermedia khalayak, menonton konten YouTube 2 jam nggak ngapa-ngapain. Lalu ada juga Stebi Julionathan. Stebi akan membawakan karyanya yang berjudul Tubuh yang Diatur, Hasrat yang Dijinakan, Komodifikasi Representasi Queer dalam Film Boys Love Asia Tenggara. Yang terakhir ada kawan kita Ardiles Akiwen yang akan bicara soal sinkretisme spiritualitas Kristen dan tete nenek moyang, kajian visual dan perlawanan estetik pada zine fotografi board. Baiklah, untuk pertama saya akan mengundang teman-teman kita yang sangat bersemangat ini. Ada Resti Ayu Febriani, Siska Ayu Dia Sekarini, dan juga Khadijah Akbar Hanafi untuk hadir. Semuakah atau perwakilan? Halo? Resti Ayu.
Halo.
Halo Resti, aku panggilnya apa? Resti kah?
Ya, boleh Resti.
Oke. Kamu bertiga atau kamu sendiri mewakili?
Hari ini saya berdua sama Khadijah.
Oke, halo Khadijah. Sebelum kalian presentasi, aku ingin memperkenalkan dulu kalian. Jadi teman kita ini, Resti dan juga Khadijah ini pemudi-pemudi yang sangat kreatif ya, karena mereka ini baru saja belum lama lulus dari sastra Inggris UIN Raden Mas Said Surakarta. Lalu mereka bergiat untuk menulis dan juga bikin film. Dan salah satu film mereka itu The Dish itu sudah publish ya. Lalu jurnal mereka yang berjudul An Analysis of Psychosocial Development of Marilyn Monroe as Seen from Blonde tahun 2002 itu sekarang sedang dalam proses publikasi. Jadi hopefully kita akan bisa mengakses itu ya, Resti dan Khadijah. Oke, so sekarang kalian sedang Resti dan Khadijah sedang menyelesaikan master degrees-nya. Oke, so langsung saja waktu kalian 10 menit. 10 menit untuk presentasi. Jadi time is yours. Silakan.
Okay, can I confirm if everybody can see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Resti Ayu, and I am joined today by my partner, Hadija. And unfortunately, our teammate, Siska, could not make it because due to the work commitment. So together we will be presenting our research title, Class, Gender, and Resistance, Intertextual Feminism in Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games and Enola Holmes in Enola Holmes series. Okay. The study examines how class and gender intersects to shape women resistance, analyzed through the lens of Marxism, feminism, and intertextual. Well, let's begin with the background of the research. First, our issue. Our study focuses on class, gender, resistance because these are always interconnected. Economic inequality often works together with patriarchal domination, creating a continuous cycle of oppression. And next, for the topic, we use Marxism feminism, which emphasizes the economic value of women's unpaid domestic labor. It argues that housework and women's reproductive roles actually support the capitalist system by producing surplus value. And the final for the object has two characters. The first one is Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games, 2012, and then Enola Holmes from Enola Holmes series. Both characters represent women who resist oppression, which Katniss against the capitalist regime, and Enola against patriarchal society in Victorian England. And now we've looked at the background of the theory of. Let's move on to the character overview. First, we have Katniss Everdeen. So Katniss Everdeen is a 16 years old girl from District 12 who is the main character of the Hunger Games 2012. She was raised in District 12, known as the poorest and the smallest district in the nation of Panem. She even learned how to hunt to survive. She turns into a symbol of rebellion as the volunteer herself in the Hunger Game competition. With her fighting spirit, she succeeded in becoming the oppressive regime, the capital. The second character we have Enola Holmes. So Enola Holmes is the main character of Enola Holmes 2020 and 2022. She is a smart and curious young girl from Victorian England. She always challenges society's cruel standard for women and fights for justice for women. Since she is always taught by her mother to think freely and be brave. Enola uses smartness, curiosity, and bravery to survive in a world controlled by men. Okay. After understanding both characters and their social position, we can now connect this insight to the main focuses of our study. So next, we'll look at the research question that guide this analysis to help us explore how class